Τεταρτη. Και γι' αυτό ακριβώς έχουμε καλέσει τον Ken Spiro, τον Ραβίνο Ken Spiro, για να μας μιλήσει αυτό το θέμα. Είμαι σίγουρη ότι ξέρετε ποιος φταίει για όλα. Για όλα τα δεινά του κόσμου. Οι Εβραίοι και οι ποδηλάτες. Και αυτό το ανέκδοτο το ανέβασε κάποιος στο Facebook και ο Αλέξανδρος Μοδιάνο ανεβάζει μια φωτογραφία από Εβραίοι με κιπά, μουσική κτλ. Επάνω σε ποδήλατα. Σίγουρα αυτοί φταίνε. Λοιπόν, να σας πω λίγα λόγια για τον ομιλητή μας. Ο Ραβίνος Ken Spiro είναι λέκτορας και αναλυτής στη σχολή Asia Torah Discovery Seminar. Παράλληλα, έχει άδεια ξεναγού από τον Ισραηλινό Υπουργό Τουρισμού. Είχαμε την χαρά να τον ακούσουμε εμείς οι κυρίες που ήμασταν στο ταξίδι του JWRP φέτος και πρόπερσι. Φέτος και την περασμένη εβδομάδα, τέλος πάντων. Το JWRP είναι μια οργάνωση που ταξιδεύει γυναίκες από όλο τον κόσμο στο Ισραήλ και θα υπάρχει άλλη μια αποστολή τον επόμενο Νοέμβρη του 2015 και όποιος ενδιαφέρεται ας μιλήσει για περισσότερες πληροφορίες με την κυρία Χέντερ Ναχμία στην εμένα. Λοιπόν, οπότε εκεί ακούσαμε τον Ken Spiro, ήταν καταπληκτικός, είπαμε να τον φέρουμε και εδώ. Λοιπόν, είναι απόφοιτος του κολέγιου Βάσα και έχει πτυχίο στη ρώσικη γλώσσα μάλιστα και λογοτεχνία και παράλληλα έκανε μεταπτυχιακές του σπουδές στο Ινστιτούτο Πούσκιν στη Μόσχα. Έχει μεταπτυχιακό τίτλο στην ιστορία από το Vermont College του Norwich University και χειροτεχνήθηκε ραβίνος από την Yeshiva Asia Torah στη Ιερουσαλήμ. Λοιπόν, πολλά ταλέντα. Από τώρα μέχρι ρώσικα, ιστορία, έχει εμφανιστεί σε σειρά τηλεοπτικών και ραδιοφωνικών εκπομπών σε γνωστούς σταθμούς ανά τον κόσμο. Είναι ο συγγραφέας του World Perfect, The Jewish Impact in Civilization και του Crash Course in Jewish History και μπορείτε να ανατρέξετε στο συγγραφικό του έργο και στις διαλέξεις του στο σελίδα H.com. Ο Ραβίνος Ken Spiro γεννήθηκε και μεγάλωσε στις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες και από το 1982 διαμένει στο Ισραήλ. Έχει υπηρετήσει σε μονάδα πεζικού της IDF και διαμένει στο Givat Ze'ev στη Ιερουσαλήμ με τη γυναίκα του και τα 5 παιδιά του. Λοιπόν, χωρίς άλλη καθυστέρηση, ο Ραβίνος Ken Spiro.
It's working? It's working now? Can you all hear me? Hi, good evening, everyone. Nice to be here. This is the end of my speaking tour. I was in Prague and Frankfurt. I'm working my way slowly back to Israel. So please God, tomorrow I'll be leaving you. I got all excited. I landed yesterday. I saw flags and everything. I said, guys, you really want to welcome me? Then I realized it was Independence Day. So as we say in Hebrew, Chag Sameach, it's a holiday. It's very nice to be here for it, actually. I watched the parade today. Just to give a little more information, my mother wrote that introduction, so you have to. As you heard, I was born in New York, New York. I was actually raised in a completely non-religious home. I didn't know anything about Zionism, Israel, Judaism, and I went to a public school and high school and university, and you heard I was a Russian major. And when I graduated from college, I got into grad school to do international business. I was studying Russian and Japanese. I wanted to know exotic languages. And I decided when I got into grad school after my second degree, I took a year off because first I wanted to get fluent in one of the languages I was learning. You know, you can learn a language for years in a classroom, but if you want to actually speak it, what do you have to do? You have to live there, right? If you want to learn Spanish, you have to live in Florida or California. So my plan was to go half a year as a graduate student to the Soviet Union, to the University of Moscow. And then I was going to go to Israel and go to kibbutz. I'd never been to Israel. I was going to volunteer for kibbutz and learn Hebrew and work on my suntan for 3 months. So when I went off to Russia, the Soviet Union, and a lot of you remember that. Not that you're old, but you're old enough to remember the Soviet Union. Most of my students are about 20 years old, and they think that the Soviet Union was sometime around the time of the American Revolutionary War. But in the Soviet Union, it was illegal for a Jew to even own a book in Hebrew. You get arrested for trying to practice Judaism. The first lesson I learned, by the way, is if you want to get a Jew to do something, tell them they can't, and they all go do it. It's the Jewish personality. I spent 6 months very rarely going to classes and hanging out with hundreds of young Russian Jews who were literally risking their lives to try and be Jewish. And I was so impressed. I said, there must be something to this Judaism that I haven't experienced, so maybe I'll do something a little more meaningful than just go to kibbutz and pick grapefruits. I'm going to learn about my heritage. So I checked into Esha Torah in the old city of Jerusalem. How many of you guys have been to Israel? Very close. It's a short drive from here. So my plan was to stay for 3 months. I stayed a little longer. I'm now at 3 months and 33 years. So I stayed, I studied full-time, as you heard. I got smicha, so I'm a rabbi. I have a master's degree in history. I'm a licensed tour guide. I spend about 80% of my time in Israel teaching and guiding and writing, like the JWRP groups. How many women from the JWRP program are here? Oh, they're all in the corner, okay. And the other 20%, I go on speaking tours to exotic places like New York and Athens, which is why I married a travel agent. My wife, by the way, is from London, England, and she speaks English and tells me I don't speak English. And I live in Givat Ze'ev, right outside Jerusalem. I have 5 kids, Kanaharas, we say in Yiddish. My oldest son is a married architect student. He was a sniper and a medic in the paratroopers. Isn't that a great combination of jobs, sniper and medic? My next oldest son is in nursing school, was a combat medic in the Golani Brigade. You guys know something about the IDF? He actually spent, as a reserve soldier, he spent 34 days in Gaza during the last war. I have a married daughter who is a nurse. Most important, she's the mother of my gorgeous Yemenite granddaughters. Both my kids who are married Jews of Yemenite extraction, which is great. You don't want to marry your first cousin for too long. You end up with Prince Charles. Not so healthy. Anyway, my English wife is going to be very upset when she hears that. And I have identical twin girls who are 21 years old. One is the chief engineer in the Haifa Naval Base, which is very interesting. She's parking these huge submarines. She doesn't park a car very well. And her twin sister, she's really small, both very small. She's the head medic in the only mixed male-female combat unit in the world, which is called Karakal. So my house is very militarized and a great house to get injured in. We have 2 nurses, 3 medics. Okay, that's the introduction to me, but I want to introduce a very serious topic tonight, which is called Why the Jews? It's a PowerPoint presentation. It takes about 3/4 of an hour, and I'm going to try and speak slowly. I apologize. I tend to speak quickly. I'm doing my best. I know a lot of you have a translator. I promised the translator I wouldn't try and kill him by speaking too fast. But because it's a PowerPoint, and it's sort of like watching a movie, if people have questions, if you don't mind, please wait till the end, and I'll be happy to answer them then. I also have a really good website. I have a new website I just launched. I even have this presentation online, so you can watch it again. And if you want at the end, you can come take one of my business cards. My mother will be very happy if you take one of my business cards. Okay, we ready to start? So anti-Semitism is a very heavy and significant topic for the Jewish people. Certain places more so than others. I often speak in America, and very few American Jews are as connected to the Holocaust as I know the community here. The Holocaust didn't reach the United States. Most Jews I know didn't have family members, but I know in Greece it's a very, very heavy issue. So I know it's a sensitive issue, but it's important for another reason. Because this is not just a topic talking about the past. Anti-Semitism is alive and well in the world today. Okay, and it's actually at the highest levels it's been since the Holocaust. If you look at statistics, you guys know the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League? It's an organization based in America that monitors anti-Semitism. The levels of anti-Semitism in the world are unbelievable. In countries like France, it is scary. You cannot walk on the street identified as a Jew. It's dangerous. Another thing we appreciate about anti-Semitism, it's a universal phenomenon. It exists everywhere in the world at all times. There was a Harvard math professor by the name of Tom Lear. Years ago, over 40 years ago, he wrote a song called National Brotherhood Week, and it had a verse of the song that went like this.
All the Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and the Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews by during.
And people laugh, but it's not funny. And the question is why? And the why is just not a historical, philosophical question. As I said before, anti-Semitism is alive and well. And we need to get to the bottom of this phenomenon to find out what really causes it so that we can make sure that what happened to the Jews of Europe between 1939 and 1945 never happens to us again. Now, if you ask the experts, the historians, the sociologists, why we're hated, they generally give one of 7 explanations for what causes anti-Semitism. And here they are. Number 1 is economics. Those Jews are too powerful and too wealthy. Number 2 is chosen people. They think they're better than everyone else. No one likes an elitist. Number 3 is scapegoat. We're always in the right place at the wrong time. Blame the Jews for your problems. Number 4 is the one that's the most common today. It's Israel. It's Zionism. It's the occupation. It's how the Jews are treating the Palestinians. Number 5 is what's called the outsiders, or a 5th column, which is an idiom in English. Jews are a minority you can never really trust. They're never really loyal. 6 is deicide, the Christian accusation that we killed Jesus. And 7 is the one that was used by Hitler. Jews are a different and obviously inferior race. You guys seen these before? Yeah, we've come across these, right? Pretty much any explanation for why supposedly Jews are hated will fall into one of these 7 categories. But what we need to do now is look at each of these through the lens of truth and fact and see what's a cause versus what's an excuse. Let's define our terms. Causes versus excuses. There's a cartoon in America called Calvin and Hobbes. I don't think it made it to Greece, right? It's about a 7-year-old boy with a very overactive imagination who's always getting into trouble. So here's an example of cause versus excuse. Why didn't Calvin do his homework? Now here you see he's telling the principal of the school all of these ridiculous stories about what happened to him that he couldn't do his homework. But excuses, we know by definition, are they true or are they false? Right? Excuses are always false. By the way, keep in mind, ladies and gentlemen, this is very important when we talk about the serious topic of anti-Semitism, that millions of people believe things about us that have no basis in reality. But we can't change or stop doing something we never were or something we were never doing in the first place. Excuses are imagination. What we need to get to is the cause. What's the thing we are doing or aren't doing or need to do differently that if we change it, the anti-Semitism will go away? Which is why, in my opinion, this is one of the most important talks that we need to hear. Okay? Because what we're going to hear now is, from the Jewish perspective, not only what is the cause of anti-Semitism, but from the Jewish perspective, the traditional Jewish perspective, what is the real solution? And any doctor knows, right, that when you're dealing with a patient who is sick, you can treat the symptoms, but unless you deal with the real disease, the patient's never going to get better. And that's why this is so important. So let's now begin at the beginning and look at each of these 7 supposed explanations. For every one of them, we're going to explain what they are. Then we're going to analyze, are they true or are they false? We're going to get rid of the false ones and be left with what is the one true cause of anti-Semitism. Is everyone with me? How's the translator doing? Good? Makes sense? Okay. If I hear you laughing at the wrong time, I'm going to... Not that this is such a funny topic. I'm not speaking too fast? Okay, I'm trying really hard. I was once speaking in America. How many of you guys been to America? America have very different speaking speeds. And New Yorkers, everything's fast. You go to the South in America, everything's slow. If you're from New York, it's torture. I was once speaking in Montgomery, Alabama. You guys seen Forrest Gump? Everyone there sounds like Forrest Gump. Like 1 minute into my talk, a guy raises his hand, he says, "Would you mind slowing down?" So I said, "Okay." So he said, "Just because we talk slow doesn't mean we're stupid." Okay. Anyway, seriously. Let's look at number 1. Okay, economic theory. We hate the Jews because they have too much power, too much money. Where does the association of Jews and money first begin? Does anyone know? Where's the first? Yeah.
Because Jews weren't allowed to own property, land, and so they had to be money lenders. They had to be able to take their property with them.
That's easy. You're not originally from here, are you?
No.
Okay. You're right. What's your name?
Andrea Gilbert.
Andrea Gilbert said exactly. Jews in medieval Europe were locked out of all professions, couldn't own land, couldn't be in trade guilds. The Catholic Church decided that Christians couldn't lend money at interest. And since Jews are already going to hell for all the other horrible things they did, we'll force them to lend money. But it's not that Jews were hated because they lent money. Jews are forced into it. By the way, these are Renaissance period wood carvings. And you see, by the way, this is the image for a Jew in medieval Europe in the Renaissance. It's not a Magen David, a Star of David. It's a circle, which is a coin. Notice, by the way, the devil is always a Jew. Look at those feet. But how do we know it's not the reason why Jews are hated? First of all, Jews were forced into doing it. Second of all, other groups that lent money, like the Lombards, the northern Italian bankers, who lent money at much higher rates of interest, weren't attacked for doing that. But more than that, the real association of Jews and money becomes much more powerful at the beginning of the 20th century with the publication of the most famous forgery in human history, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Have you guys heard of this book? Yes. It was written by the secret police of the Tsar of Russia in the year 1901. And it's supposedly the minutes of a meeting that takes place once every 100 years when the rabbis get together to plan the next 100 years of Jewish control of the world. Now, how do we know it's a forgery besides we know it's a forgery? Anyone who thinks that 10 rabbis in a room can agree on anything knows nothing about the Jewish people. But you know, after the Bible and possibly the Quran, there are more versions of this book in print than any other book on the planet Earth. It's even a bestseller in countries that don't have any Jews. Like in Japan. I have a friend who grew up in Japan. And he told me, he's actually an Iraqi Jew who grew up in Japan. And he told me, you know why they buy the book? Not because they're anti-Semitic, but they believe it's true and they want to know how the Jews are doing it so they can copy it. But we know it's nonsense. And a good example is, this is a true story. They made a movie out of it called The Voyage of the Damned. It's a true story about a boat. A month before the start of World War II, Hitler takes a ship called the St. Louis and he sticks 1,000 Jews on it. Now let's say it's true, we control the world. How hard would it be for a bunch of people who control the world to find a place to go in a boat? Easy. They buy their way in. What happened? Anyone know the story of the ship?
Yes.
What happened in the ship? Do you remember?
I don't exactly remember, but
It circled around the Atlantic Ocean for months. Right. No one took any of them. It went back to Europe, and many of these people were killed in the Holocaust. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, if you think about it, the Holocaust, primarily, Jews, I don't know about in Greece, but I imagine Greek Jews are probably middle class, upper middle class. America also, Jews are the very high end of income earners in the United States. But this is a post-World War II phenomenon. Wealthy Jews, like the Rothschilds, were the exception, but the vast majority of Jews, especially the Jews killed in the Holocaust, in places like Eastern Europe and I'm sure in Greece, were at best middle class, and many were very, very poor. But more than that, you guys heard of the Nuremberg laws? Yeah. In 1935, 2 years after Hitler gets to power, he passes laws robbing Jews of their citizenship, their right to vote, their businesses, their bank accounts. So if the threat the Jews pose is economic and political, and that can be neutralized with legislation, then why do you have to go kill them? They're now powerless. Obviously, in Hitler's mind, the threat is something much deeper, and we'll get to that later. But this whole notion that the reason why Jews are hated is because of their power, people may believe it, but it's a myth. It's a myth. By the way, I say it's a double myth. Because if people really believed the Jews were as powerful as they were, you wouldn't mess with such people, would you? I would never start up with someone who controls the world. It's an interesting side point. They don't even believe that. Okay, let's look at number 2. Chosen people. By the way, most people don't even understand what this means, really. But it is true. We don't believe we're special. And we don't believe we're better than other people. We do believe we have a unique destiny and a unique mission in this world. And Jews have always believed that even living outside the land of Israel, ultimately our job is to go back to this land of Israel, make a unique nation that's a light to nations, and be a model for the rest of the world. So maybe people might resent that sort of unique view we have of our destiny. But what happens in history? With the emancipation, with Napoleon Bonaparte, with the walls of the ghettos coming down in the early 19th century, Jews run to embrace enlightened Europe. The Reform movement, which starts in Hamburg, Germany in 1811. The first thing that movement drops, and it was designed as a movement to allow Jews to be German and to be totally comfortable in German society, the first thing they drop is any mention of Jews being a unique or special nation. We're not a nation, we are Germans of the Mosaic persuasion, meaning from Moses, but we're Germans. And we're not going back to Israel. They drop any mention of Israel, any mention of Jerusalem, any mention of the temple in Jerusalem. Germany is our Israel, or Berlin, or Hamburg, or Frankfurt. That's our Jerusalem. So here, the most enlightened country in Europe, with a Jewish population that love Germany, is saying, we're not special, we're not chosen. Our destiny is to be one with the German people. Does the hatred go away? No, it goes to sleep for a century, and then it comes back in an even more virulent, more violent form. But more than that, ladies and gentlemen, every faith and every people think they're chosen or special. The red sun is in the center of the flag of Japan because they believe they're closest to the gods, the rising sun. The word for China in Chinese means center of the universe. By the way, traditionally, the word for non-Chinese is either monkey or barbarian. Not very politically correct. And Christianity and Islam both believe in what's called replacement theology. Traditionally, they believe that God chose the Jews, rejected the Jews, and then chose us instead. So every religion, every nation thinks they're better, thinks they're special, thinks they're chosen, but only we're hated for it. And even when we say we're not, the hatred doesn't go away. If you think you're treating the disease, but you're still sick, it means what? You're not really dealing with what are the causes. So this is also a lie. Keep going. Scapegoats. Scapegoat, by the way, comes from Judaism. Anyone know where it comes from? The term scapegoat. Anyone know where it is? The original? Sorry? Yeah, where? What are we talking about? Trivia question.
From the Isaac stories.
Well, not from Isaac, although that is. Anyone know? It's from the Yom Kippur service in the temple. Sa'ir la'azazel. They would take a goat and confess the sins of the Jewish people on the goat and send the goat off a cliff. It's a very powerful symbolic act. The goat didn't do anything wrong. Scapegoat, by definition, means taking someone who is blameless and blaming them for something they didn't do. Why do that, by the way? What's the purpose of having scapegoats in history? To distract attention from who's really guilty. This one is true. We are always scapegoated, but scapegoating by definition is always an excuse. But there's another aspect of scapegoating we need to focus on, ladies and gentlemen. Here's Hitler speaking at a rally in 1935. The motto of the rally is, "The Jews are our misfortune," which was the byline of Der Stürmer, the Nazi newspaper. Every day the newspaper came out, it says, "The Jews are our misfortune." What's the crowd's reaction when Hitler is ranting about how evil the Jew is for the world? How are they reacting? They're cheering, they think it's great. Wow, we agree, fantastic. Imagine he stands up and says, we must fight against the greatest enemy of the world, the midgets. How do you say midgets in Greek? Sorry? Nanus? Come on, what's the crowd's reaction now? They think Adolf is out of his mind. Why, when they hear about Jews, they think it makes sense and they cheer? They hear about midgets, they think he's crazy. Do Jews really make that much more sense than midgets? Not really. But what I'm pointing out now is when you take someone to hate them, you just can't pick anyone, as we say in English, to pick someone out of a hat randomly. You have to pick someone that people already love to hate. And what Hitler is building on actually is centuries of classic Christian anti-Semitism against the Jews, which was the religion of Europe. And we get to this one, we see the specific accusation is, of course, Christ killer. Deicide. We killed someone else's God. How can you possibly do anything worse than that? But there are many aspects of deicide that really don't make sense. First of all, historians say Jesus was born in the year 1 and he dies around the year 34. Let's say the Jews are really responsible. When should the Christian world be most angry at the Jews? Right after the event or 1,000 years later? For instance, this is not a Greek history question, but America. You guys know America had a civil war in the 19th century. You guys know the American Civil War? It's good. Most of my American students don't know this. Between 1861 and 1865, the North and the South. Who won? The North. That my American students don't know at all. They live in the South. They think the South's going to do it again. By the way, the Southerners call the war of Northern aggression. But seriously, when should the Southerners be most angry at the Northerners? 1866 or 2015? 1866. We say in English, time dulls all pain. You forget about it after a while. Imagine you're living in New York and you fly to Florida in the winter. This is the sign you see. Welcome to Miami, Northerners not welcome. As we'd say in English, get over it. When is the accusation of Christ killer first used to instigate massive violence against Jews? 1,000 years later, after the event, at the time of the First Crusade. Okay, that's weird. But more than that, if you look in the Gospel, which is hardly favorable towards the Jews, you can see here that overwhelmingly the Gospel records it's the Romans, the Romans, the Romans. The Romans arrest Jesus, they try him, they crucify him. Okay, some Jews were involved in the plot. Let's split the blame 50-50. No, we get all the blame, and they get the church named after them. The Roman Catholic Church. But more than that, by the way, the Pope, John Paul, the 23rd, the Vatican II, in 1965, the most significant statement made about Jews in 2,000 years, the Pope, who can't be wrong, I know in Greece you have the Eastern Orthodox Patriarch, but okay, Catholics have the Pope. The Pope says, no Jew alive today can be responsible for Jesus' death 2,000 years later, and only a few Jews in his lifetime had anything to do with it. So when the Pope forgives us for something that we didn't even do, nothing changes. This is all just more excuses. But when you look at Christian anti-Semitism, you see some of the most illogical, dangerous excuses. For instance, what's unique about kosher meat? Besides what kind of animals you can eat, like no pig, and you have to shecht the animal, right? Shchita, ritual slaughtering. You also cannot eat any blood. So what are Jews accused of starting in 1144 in Norwich, England? We're accused of kidnapping a Christian child. It's called a blood libel. Kidnapping a Christian, here's an image of it. Christian image. These are all Jews with their Jewish signs and their Jewish hats they had to wear. Slaughtering the child, making incisions, the blood is being collected in a bowl. Why do Jews need Christian babies' blood, according to the thinking behind this? Oh, don't answer yet. It's a multiple choice question, which in Israel is called an American test. A, it's the chief ingredient in matzah. By the way, Jews always dreaded this time of year precisely because of that accusation, right before Pesach. 2, all Jewish men menstruate. Men. And need a monthly blood transfusion. 3, all Jews, as a punishment for killing Jesus, suffer from hemorrhoids. And the only known cure for hemorrhoids 1,000 years ago is Christian babies' blood. Last, number 4, Jewish boys when they're circumcised, Brit Milah, lose so much blood, they need Christian babies' blood to replenish the loss. What's the correct answer?
First one.
All of the above. All 4. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's obvious that none of these have anything to do with reality. Yet this is what's taught about us. Interesting, this, by the way, blood libel in psychology, Carl Jung, you know Freud and Jung? Jung would call this transference, which means you always have a magnifying glass for the faults in yourself that you see in other people. Think about it. What's the central ritual in a Catholic Mass? In the church, the main ritual is called the Eucharist. The priest changes the wine and the wafer into the body and the blood of Jesus. I don't know, does Eastern Orthodoxy do this also? Same thing. In the 13th century, the Catholic Church said this is not symbolic. When you eat that wafer and when you drink that wine, you are eating Christ's body and drinking his blood. So what are Jews accused of starting in Germany and Switzerland? Here you can see, this is an illustration in German. Breaking into a church, stealing the communion wafers, the crackers, bringing them back to the synagogue, stabbing them with knives. The crackers are screaming and blood is pouring out. And there they're dividing up the crackers to torture them and burn them, to reenact the death of Jesus. But thank God, they're caught, the Jews. And the Jews are beheaded. And the Jews are tortured with hot tongs. Here they're being burned alive. And the host is returned to the church. The Jews are dead. And God is happy. We hate the Jews because they torture crackers. Now you almost want to laugh at that, except in Belitz in Switzerland, about 3,000 Jews were burned alive in one giant house based on that accusation, which is completely false. What's the most non-kosher animal in the world?
Pig.
The pig. So what's the animal always associated with Jews in medieval art? This image is particularly, you find it in Germany. I just came from Frankfurt, by the way, where the last image was on the bridge that crossed the Main River right outside the ghetto. Look at the image here. It's all the same, but here's the best example. This is on the bridge in Frankfurt outside the ghetto that thousands of non-Jews are seeing every day. It's called Judensau, Jewish pig. And here you have a big fat pig. Notice they're all called rabbis. Here's the devil as a Jew. Here's one Jew who is suckling from the pig, and here the pig is defecating into a Jew's mouth and he's eating it. This is on a bridge in Germany for hundreds of years. When Hitler stands up and says the Jews are subhuman, evil devils, he's building on thousands, literally almost 2,000 years of violent hatred against the Jews in Europe. But all of this is, of course, nonsense. Keep going. Jews are outsiders. Now, by the way, this is the main reason we don't like anyone in this world. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen. Most hatred and intolerance is caused by what? Dislike of the other, the different. I'm white, you're black. This is my religion, that's your religion. Okay? And it is true that for most of the history of the Jewish people living in the diaspora, scattered around the world, we Jews chose to look, dress, and act differently, and were also forced to look, dress, and act differently. So one could imagine these differences would make people suspicious and fearful of us. But then along comes Napoleon, and the emancipation of the Jews, where the ghetto walls come down, and Western European Jews run to join European society. Napoleon's emissary, he offers the Jews, he says to the Jews as individuals, right? Everything. Meaning if you Jews want to drop your differences and become Frenchmen, we'll give you the same rights as everyone else. But if you want to stay as separate people, don't expect anything special. If you want to be loyal to us, we'll give you the rights. Napoleon even convenes an assembly of Jewish notables and a great Sanhedrin, putting 100 rabbis in a room in 1807, and he asks them a series of questions. Can you Jews live amongst us and be loyal citizens? By the way, the answers the rabbis give are unbelievable. I've never seen rabbis talk so much and say so little. Actually, I have a couple times in synagogue. But it works because as Napoleon conquers Europe in the 19th century, for the first time in over 1,000 years, Jews are finally granted citizenship and equal rights. And they run to do what primarily in Western Europe? to leave their Jewish identity behind and to largely assimilate. And it seems like we found the answer to anti-Semitism. We were hated because we were just so different. I'm telling you, ladies and gentlemen, if you had asked a historian or a sociologist in 1850, what's going to be with anti-Semitism in 1950, you know what they would have said? There's not going to be any anti-Semitism in 1950 because there's not going to be any Jews. They're just going to assimilate like everyone else. But then along comes the famous Dreyfus affair. You guys heard of this? The most famous trial in the 19th century. The hero of the story is this man, Alfred Dreyfus, 34-year-old French Jew. Now remember, the French in 1791 already allowed the Jews equal rights. The first country in Europe after Napoleon. And Jews could go to university and be professors. They could join the army and be officers. At the same time, in Germany, for instance, Jews could go to university, but they couldn't be professors. They could join the army, but they couldn't be officers until World War I. You know, Adolf Hitler got his Iron Cross. You guys know what an Iron Cross is? Highest German military award from his Jewish commanding officer in World War I. But Dreyfus was a completely assimilated Jew and a totally loyal Frenchman. France was seemingly all enlightened and accepting, but it was just a facade, a veneer. Underneath the French government, the French army was deeply anti-Semitic. Dreyfus was found guilty of being a spy. He was completely innocent. He was publicly tried in Paris. Here you can see them breaking his sword. Watch, and he's sent to Devil's Island off the coast of Brazil, a French penal colony. By the way, historically, he was retried 2 more times. 3 times he was tried, 3 times found guilty, and eventually only pardoned. Never found innocent, even though he was totally innocent. Watching the trial as a 34-year-old Hungarian Jew working as a journalist, living in Vienna, whose name was Theodor Herzl, completely assimilated. And he's shocked, because what's the crowd screaming when Dreyfus is being court-martialed? Not screaming, death to Dreyfus the traitor. What's he screaming? À mort les Juifs. Kill the Jews. And he writes in his diary, where is this happening? In Paris? 100 years after emancipation? For him, as we'd say, it's a Greek word, epiphany. It's an epiphany. Like the sky opens up and he sees clearly, aha, this is not going to work. Whatever we do, they hate us. When we're different, they hate us for being different. When we become like them, they hate us for being like them. The only solution, and by the way, Herzl didn't found Zionism. He joins the movement 12 years after it was founded and rises to the top of it. But all early Zionist intellectuals believed that the reason for what they called the Jewish question, anti-Semitism, was we are a stateless people. Every other nation has a homeland and an army and a passport and an embassy. We are at everyone's mercy. When we have these things, anti-Semitism will cease. Now, sadly, by the way, Herzl died in 1904 at the age of 44. Fast forward 100 years later, amazing, we have a Jewish state. But not only has it not solved the anti-Semitism issue, the #1 excuse for hating Jews in the world today is what? Israel. Specifically, Israel, the fact that it exists, it's an occupying, illegitimate country, which is an apartheid state. I'm sure you guys get this stuff in Greece. And it comes out like in the last war in Gaza. I'm sure you had protests in the street, and it's unbelievable. Now, I'm not going to do a class on the Middle East, but of course this is complete nonsense. First of all, we know, forgetting the historical, ancient connection of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. You know, Joshua brought the Jewish people into the land of Israel 1,900 years before Muhammad was even born. Forget that. Muhammad, the founder of Islam. Okay, someone asked, who's Muhammad? I heard. So, 1947, the UN votes to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The Jews accepted, the Arabs did what? Had they accepted it then, what would have happened?
It would have.
Along with Israel would have been born a second country, Palestine, whatever. But they try and destroy us. Okay, and then we know, as a consequence of that war, Jordan illegally seized this territory, which today they call the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, and Egypt illegally seized the Gaza Strip, meaning these are not part of their internationally recognized territory. By the way, there were no UN resolutions condemning Jordanian occupation for 19 years. In 1967, they again try and destroy us, and only then, fighting a war for our survival, do we get those territories. So that, by the way, for 19 years there was no occupation, right? We didn't have the land. If the occupation is the root of the problem, why are they trying to destroy us before we occupy the territory? And after 1967, Prime Minister Levi Eshkol immediately offers the Arabs, we'll give you the land back, just make peace with us, let us live in peace. Even though our country's only, like 15 kilometers wide. From Netanya to it's unbelievable. From Netanya to Kalkilia is 9 miles, or about 15 kilometers. What's the Arab world's reaction? Here's the Arab League in Khartoum in the summer of 1967. No peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel, no recognition of Israel. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that since 1993, since Oslo, you guys know the Oslo Accords? It's been frozen since then. It's 22 years. Why? First of all, 97% of the Palestinian population lives under Palestinian Authority control. But why is there no state? Because every Palestinian offer, every time it's been offered, whether it was Barak in 2000 or Ehud Olmert in 2007, they've rejected it. So the notion, if the occupation is the root of the problem, why are they hating us when we're not occupying the territory? And even when we offer to make peace and give it to them, they say no. By the way, not to do a class on the Middle East, but it's never been about Israel's occupation. It's always been about the Arab world's inability to accept a Jewish state of any size. Fact. But this is clearly another excuse. It's not the cause of anti-Semitism. Okay, we got to the last one, and this is, of course, the one that Adolf Hitler used so lethally against the Jewish people. Hitler took the ideas of Friedrich Nietzsche, of racial superiority, and by the way, the Darwinian evolutionary theory, you should know, in the 20th century, there was a lot of idea of eugenics, of breeding, not necessarily a master race, but the notion of racial thinking begins in America first, and is exported largely to Germany by Americans, by people like Henry Ford. Interesting. But Hitler takes it to the next step. And he creates this whole theory of race, that just like in the animal kingdom, certain animals are superior to other animals, just so too in the human kingdom. Certain races of human beings are superior to others. Who do the Germans say is the ideal, perfect master race? The Aryan, which, by the way, the term Aryan has nothing to do with Northern Europeans. It's one of the titles of the Emperor of Iran. Okay, in India. It's nothing to do, but blonde-haired, blue-eyed Northern Europeans are the most intellectually and physically perfect specimen. Below them are Southern Europeans, then Slavic peoples, then Asians, then blacks, then who's at the bottom? The Juden, the Jew, subhuman. And Hitler makes this whole ridiculous fake scientific devices. Jews have smaller brains and are physically weaker, and they look like this. By the way, I don't know Jews who look like this, but he looks just like Mahmoud Abbas. But guys, all this is nonsense. There is no such thing as a Jewish race. Like I said, both my kids who are married Jews from Yemen. I have gorgeous colored grandchildren. My son-in-law is so dark, his nickname is Shoko, which is chocolate, which Americans think is so racist, but in Israel, totally not. But there's no such thing as a Jewish race. We come in every size, shape, and color, and Hitler's racial theories are exactly what they are. Pseudo-science, there is no basis for them. So if we look at all the supposed reasons why we're hated, we can cross them all off. None of them, most of them are complete fantasy, and none of them begin to explain anti-Semitism. Not only that, ladies and gentlemen, none of them have anything to do with Judaism, religion. You notice there's nothing Jewish about hating Jews? It's about money, it's about race. What's the most famous diary from the Holocaust? Anne Frank. Okay, who's read Anne Frank's diary? It's the most read book about the Holocaust period. Who's been to the house in Holland? It's amazing to visit. It's the National Holocaust Memorial for Holland. And you guys know, like it's in Greece, the Dutch, by the way, turned over many of their Jews. And Dutch Jews suffered. I know Greece, most people aren't aware of how much of the Greek Jewish community was decimated in the Holocaust. One of the highest percentages. And most people don't know that. They think of Eastern Europe, but Dutch Jews also. Anne Frank was German, by the way. Her family fled to Holland. They hid in an attic. And then some Dutch person told the Gestapo, and they were arrested, and she dies of typhus in Bergen-Belsen a month before liberation. The only person to survive is her father, Otto Frank. He finds the diary, he publishes it, it becomes a runaway bestseller. Anne Frank is not a religious girl. She's a little traditional, but not Orthodox Jew. But look what she says at 12 years old. She says, "Who knows, it might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason, and that reason only, do we now suffer. We can never become just Netherlanders or English or representatives of any country for that matter. We will always remain Jews." Interesting. She's saying the one thing that no one else is saying. Now, the Diary of Anne Frank became a play. Anyone see the play?
Yeah.
Now, there's no way that anyone who wrote that play is going to put this line in here. This is way too Jewish. So you want to see how it appears in the Broadway show? Here's how it appears. Well, one day it's one group, and the next day another. Like Hitler sitting in Germany going, "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, and now it's time for der Juden to go." That's it? 6 million Jews, 1.5 million children, died for some random reason? Can't be. There's got to be something else going on here. So in the time we have left, what I now want to do is switch our focus and look at the Jewish perspective on anti-Semitism. And we begin by looking at one aspect that's quite unusual. The world is full of racist, bigots, and intolerant people, sadly. But there are aspects of anti-Semitism that set it apart from any other hatred in the world. This is Dr. Bernard Lewis, who's Professor Emeritus Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Look what he says about Jew hate. He says, hatred of Jews has many parallels and yet is unique. What makes it different, he says, in its persistence and its extent, in its potency and its virulence, its terrible final solution. Conventional prejudice and persecution can be very terrible, but they differ from anti-Semitism as does conventional from nuclear war. Which means the world is full of racist, bigots, and intolerant people, but they're just aspects of anti-Semitism that make it much more lethal and dangerous than any other form of hatred. Let's look at those aspects now. To begin with, look at the word. What's the definition of anti-Semitism? An anti-Semite is someone who can finish the sentence? Anti means hate. It's Latin, not Greek.
What is again?
Semites. Who are Semites? Middle Eastern people. It actually comes from Shem in the Noah's Ark story. Noah had 3 sons. Shem, Ham, Yafet. By the way, Jewish tradition says Greeks come from Yafet. Interesting, but Shem, I'll talk about at the end. It's an interesting little side point. But Shem, Semitic Middle Eastern people. So if you hate a Middle Eastern person like an Arab, are you an anti-Semite? No. The word was invented by a German racial thinker in 1879. His name was Wilhelm Marr. He wanted to make hatred of Jews to sound more racial and less religious, so he invents this word. It means in every dictionary in the world, prejudice or hostility towards Jews and Jews alone. And for over 100 years, it was the only form of racial or religious intolerance that had its own word to describe it. What do I mean? Again, if you hate a black person, what are you? In English, we say a racist. How do you say it in Greek? Same thing, similar word. If you hate an Asian, what are you? A racist. Only Jew hate has to have its own word to describe it? That should get us thinking there's something unique about the hatred. But there are other aspects that make it unique. Edward Flannery, who's a Catholic priest, wrote this book called The Anguish of the Jews. Look what he says. As historians of anti-Semitism look back over the millennia, the thousands of years of horror he has recorded, an inescapable conclusion emerges. Anti-Semitism is different because of its longevity and consistency. So another aspect that sets it apart is it's the oldest, longest hatred in human history. It's as old as the Jewish people themselves. A third aspect that sets it apart is the universality of it. Unlike other hatreds, hatred of us is not linked to our relationship with one race, one nation, one people, one country. Wherever we have gone in significant numbers, it has followed us as the most universal hatred in human history. Which is why Tom Lear, in his song we saw at the beginning, this group hates that group, but everyone hates the Jews. And the last thing that sets it apart, or the second to last thing, excuse me, the intensity. The dictionary definition of anti-Semitism might be prejudice or hostility. But if the worst thing that ever happened to us was a little bit of prejudice and they made some Jew jokes, that's not so bad. But if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, it is the most violent hatred in human history. It is one depressingly long list of persecution, expulsion, economic and physical marginalization, punitive taxation, ghettoization, rape, pillage, beating, up to what's the worst thing you can do to a people you hate? Kill them. What's the word for killing a nation? Genocide. And that's half Greek, half Latin. Genos means, or genos. It's a people, side Latin to kill. It's a Greek, and it's not an ancient word, even though it's from ancient languages. It's actually invented by a Polish Jewish refugee in 1944. Dr. Raphael Lemkin, fleeing from Poland during the Holocaust to England, he writes, there's a crime happening in Europe, there is no word to describe, and he invents a new word. Even that word had to be invented to describe the unique intensity of anti-Semitism. And the last thing that sets it apart is the irrationality, the confusion of anti-Semitism. Think about it. If you were to ask a white suprematist to put on a whiteboard, he'd never use a blackboard, why he dislikes black people, he'll give you like 10 horrible things black people supposedly do. But if you ask Jew haters to put on a whiteboard why they hate Jews, they'll fill up 15 boards with excuses. We hate Jews because they're capitalist, communist, warlike, passive, different, the same, strong, weak, rich, poor, dominant, lazy, servile, aggressive. What's weird about the list? It never ends and it contradicts itself. Professor Michael Curtis at Rutgers University, he said it the best. He said, anything and everything is a reason to hate the Jew. Whatever you hate, the Jew is that. But you can't win, no matter what we do. By the way, at this point, you should know some of the biggest experts in anti-Semitism. You know what they say for the cause of anti-Semitism? There is no cause. Because too many excuses means it's just illogical, irrational. If you look in the back here, this is just an unending list of excuses for hating Jews. I've heard people say it. It's a sickness, it's just we have to try and educate people that we don't do all these horrible things. The problem is it's not working. No matter how much money we spend trying to educate people and show them how nice we are to the world, the anti-Semitism doesn't go away. So in the few minutes we have left, ladies and gentlemen, we're left with a big question mark, but I now want to show you from the Jewish perspective, the traditional Jewish perspective, what drives anti-Semitism. We're going to do this in a very interesting way. We're not doing this through Jewish sources. We're going to do this through the eyes of the greatest modern Jew hater, of course, Hitler himself. And before we look at Hitler, we have to appreciate two things about him. Number one, people called him crazy. He's crazy. Let me tell you as a historian, truly crazy people end up in institutions. It takes greatness to do great things in this world, whether it's great good or great evil. To be a Hitler or a Stalin or a Churchill or an Abraham Lincoln, you gotta have potential. Okay, he's not crazy. He may have been more neurotic than most of us, but Hitler's a very clear-thinking person. Evil, absolutely, but not insane. The other thing we don't appreciate is evil people who never live in democracies and never have to worry about being elected tend to be ideologically more consistent because they don't care what you think. If you don't agree with them, they kill you. Hitler basically is remarkably consistent in his thoughts about the Jews. We're now going to look into his brain, and we're not going to do this by looking at what's his most famous book? Mein Kampf, My Struggle. That's a propaganda book. And anyone who knows about when you speak to the masses, you don't give them sophisticated, deep arguments. You give slogans and propaganda. Hitler just uses all the classic stereotypes of Jews being inferior and ugly and different and too powerful. But this is only an excuse. We're going to look at the quotes that I have now, and by the way, you go to my website. I have 3 bibliographies, reading lists, and one of them is on the Holocaust, and the books that I'm going to mention now are mentioned there. But these are quotes made by Hitler when he's talking to his elite group of Nazi intellectuals and allies. Okay? Not talking to the masses. Many of them were recorded by Hitler's personal private secretary, Martin Bormann. You guys heard of Martin Bormann? Look what Hitler says. It's unbelievable. The struggle for world domination will be fought entirely between us, between Germans and Jews. All else is facade and illusion. Behind England stands Israel, and behind France, and behind the United States. Even when we have driven the Jew out of Germany, he remains our world enemy. Now let's be clear, ladies and gentlemen. Hitler doesn't believe that Jews run America, England, and France. Hitler, as a Nazi, is at war with liberal, democratic Western Europe primarily. And he recognized correctly that the values that make up liberal Western civilization come overwhelmingly from where? The Jewish people, directly or indirectly, as I'll show you in a minute. Hitler's not saying that Jews are a physical threat, they're an ideological threat. And because he is a true intellectual and an idealist, albeit evil, remember, real intellectuals, what they say is what they do. They don't say one thing and do another. He acts accordingly. Let me give you a great example. 1944, the fall of 1944, the Germans have basically lost the war. Stalingrad has fallen. 800,000 German soldiers surrendered to the Soviet army. Unbelievable. And the Russian army's on the move through Eastern Europe. Hitler has a choice. Take trains and send soldiers to stop the advancing Soviet army, or take those trains, forget the soldiers, and let's send 500,000 Hungarian Jews to their death in Auschwitz. What does he choose to do? Kill the Jews. You see, it's military suicide. But when it's ideologically consistent, because the real enemy is not France or America or Russia, it's the Jew. And specifically, we'll see the threat is not a physical threat. Hitler goes on to say, "Providence has ordained that I should be the greatest liberator of humanity. I am freeing man from the restraints of an intelligence that has taken charge, from a dirty and degrading self-mortification of a false vision called conscience and morality, and from the demands of a freedom and a personal independence which only a very few can bear." First of all, interesting point number 2. Hollywood loves to paint evil people as ugly and evil, like they live. Remember Voldemort or Darth Vader? They're black. The people who support them are deformed. They live in dark places with insects. And guys, evil looks just like you and I. And evil thinks it's doing good. Does Hitler say I'm destroying the world? Hitler says I'm saving the world. And what am I saving it from? A false vision, a burden that is too difficult for people to deal with. Look what he says now. Unbelievable quote. "The 10 Commandments have lost their validity. Conscience is a Jewish invention. It is a blemish like circumcision." Unbelievable. This is the greatest backhanded compliment ever given to the Jewish people. You guys know what a backhanded compliment is? When you try and insult someone and you're really complimenting them? He says the Jews invented conscience. You guys know the word conscience, right? What do you say? How do you say that in Greek? Yeah, right and wrong. This is a Jewish thing, but it's artificial. It's not natural. Look what he says now. This is the next quote is unbelievable. This is the Hitler Youth song. This is, in my opinion, the last line is, in my opinion, the most important line to understand really the Holocaust. Here's the Hitler Youth song that all German kids are singing in Germany. We are the joyous Hitler Youth. We don't need any Christian virtue. Our leader is our savior. The Pope and Rabbi shall be gone. We want to be pagans once again. He's not even hiding it. We just want to go back to the way the world was before the Jews artificially, directly or indirectly, put their values on the world. Unbelievable. He goes on to say, in the natural order, classes or people superimposed in one another in strata, instead of living as neighbors. To this order we shall return as soon as the sequela of liberalism has been removed. Let me explain in simple English, because even a native English speaker doesn't understand this quote. Hitler says, nature is brutal, but nature is balanced. You guys ever watch on like the Discovery Channel, like lions hunting? By the way, lions don't hunt. The men sit there and do nothing. The women lions go and hunt. But who do they attack? When they attack a herd of wildebeests, these huge like wild cows in Africa, what? They challenge the 600 kilo alpha male to a battle? Who do they attack? They go for the babies or the old. Come on, today we hear in the news a criminal attacks an old woman or a baby. What do we think of that person? They're sick, they're evil. The lions being sick and evil? The lions being natural. Nature is brutal, but nature is balanced. In the ancient world, all ancient civilizations, you know, a baby with a minor birth defect was left out to die. Infanticide. No country respected any country's borders. I always say, if America behaved like Rome, how long would Canada be an independent country? About 5 minutes. The Canadian Army is awesome. All 8 soldiers are incredible. But seriously, America spends more on its defense budget than the next 15 countries in the world combined. Hitler says it used to be that way. Nature is brutal, but nature is balanced. The herd stays strong, the lions stay strong, but there's no mercy. Mighty empires never respected any country's borders. If they didn't conquer, it's because they couldn't conquer. Now he says, look at the world. Children who are handicapped are allowed to live. Strong nations live next to weak ones, and they survive. Who is responsible for this unnatural? Take a lion. Raise a lion in a safari park where he's never had to... You guys see that? Remember that movie Madagascar? I'd like to move it. Take a lion raised in a safari park and put him back in Africa. What happens? He ends up as lunch. He doesn't know how to be a lion anymore. This is not natural. Who is responsible, Hitler says, for this horrendous, unnatural state the world is in that's endangering the entire human race? Who's responsible? The Jews. Look what Hitler says now. Unbelievable. If one country, for whatever reason, tolerates a Jewish family in it, that family will become the germ center. He calls Jews bacteria. If one little Jewish boy survives without any Jewish education, with no synagogue and no Hebrew school, it's in his soul. It's unbelievable. He says even if there had never been a synagogue or a Jewish school or the Old Testament, the Jewish spirit would still exist and exert its influence. It has been there from the beginning, and there is no Jew, not a single one, who does not personify it. He says Jews have this unique spiritual drive. Even without any Jewish education, one way or another they will find some cause and some way to push their Jewish values on the world, which Hitler views as the most dangerous thing for the future of the human race. And therefore he comes to a very logical and lethal and evil conclusion that every single Jew has to die. Because they're bacteria, and if you let bacteria flourish, it spreads again. What's interesting is he goes on to say the heaviest blow which ever struck humanity was Christianity. Like the worst thing that ever happened. Bolshevism, which is communism, is Christianity's illegitimate child. Both are inventions of the Jew. Is Hitler correct in this point? 100%. Christianity is in every way, historically, theologically, even biologically an offshoot of Judaism. And communism, boom, comes right from the Jewish people. But Hitler says to get rid of Christianity. Hitler was virulently anti-Christian. But you don't have to kill all the Christians. Just kill the Pope. And just kill the Eastern Orthodox, patriarch. And kill the priests, and then the Christians will go back to being pagans. Kill the communist leadership, and they'll go back to being pagans. But to get rid of the mother of these illegitimate children, you just can't kill rabbis and burn down synagogues. Every Jew has this in their soul. What's even more amazing is the Talmud in Tractate Shabbat. You guys know the term the Talmud? The Talmud says something very interesting. Think about it, ladies and gentlemen. We become a nation in a very unique set of circumstances. Every other nation, like how did the Greeks become Greek? They live in a piece of real estate, and eventually, over a period of hundreds of years, they coalesce into a national identity while living in their real estate. We become a nation where? Outside our national homeland, at Mount Sinai, when we commit not to loyalty to a piece of real estate, but to loyalty to a certain vision of values based on relationship with God. So we become a nation at Sinai, which is called in Hebrew Sinai. And what does the Talmud say? Don't read it as Sinai, read it as Sin'ah, which is the Hebrew word for hatred. At Mount Sinai, anti-Semitism was born. It is hatred of the messenger, us the Jewish people, because of the message we carry in our soul. And even when the messenger forgets the message, and they're not raised with a lot of Jewish knowledge, the hater of the message, like a Hitler, understands that it's in the very essence of who we are. Interesting. Hermann Rauschning was a Nazi who became an anti-Nazi, and before World War II started, fled to America. Look what he says. He totally gets the point. It's against their own insoluble, like an unsolvable problem of being human, that the dull and base in humanity are in revolt and anti-Semitism. He's saying anti-Semitism is essentially a revolt against certain ideas. Judaism, nevertheless, together with Hellenism and Christianity, I don't have to translate Hellenism for you guys, right? Got it? Greek ideas, is an inalienable, inseparable component of our Christian Western civilization. The eternal call to Sinai against which humanity again and again rebels. It's a very powerful point this former Nazi is making. Essentially, anti-Semitism is a rebellion against certain values and ideas brought to the world by the Jewish people. And this is the point that we have to focus on for a minute. This idea of our mission in the world. Our job has never been, like I said before, to conquer the world, to convert the world. We are supposed to be a nation. We connected humanity with the idea of one God. Our job is to be a nation that collectively embodies the values that we get from relationship with God, and we teach by example. That's it. Be a model for the rest of the world, the Or Goyim. And the reality is, even though we have suffered and been the most hated people on the planet Earth, it's amazing. The smallest people who are the most hated have hands down had, directly or indirectly, the biggest impact on the world. T.R. Glover, the famous historian, says, mankind, East and West, Christian and Muslim, accepted the Jewish conviction that there was only one God. Today it is polytheism, paganism, right? That is so difficult to understand, that is so unthinkable. So despite the fact that for thousands of years the world was telling us we're wrong, was trying to kill us, today pretty much billions of people accept our worldview and our values as being essentially correct. Look at what John Adams, second president of the United States, says, one of the founding fathers. It's an amazing quote. He says, in spite of Bolingbroke and Voltaire, I will insist the Hebrews have done more to civilize men than any other nation. They are the most glorious nation that had ever inhabited this earth. The Romans and their empire were a bubble. They were nothing in comparison to the Jews. They have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other nation, ancient or modern. And if he were running for president today, I would definitely vote for him. Look what famous British non-Jewish historian says about the Jews. Paul Johnson is all at the bottom there. He says, certainly the world without the Jews would have been a radically different place. To them we owe the idea of equality before the law, both divine and human, of the sanctity of life and the dignity of human person, of individual conscience and so of personal redemption, of collective conscience and so of social responsibility, of peace as an abstract ideal, and love as the foundation of justice, and many other items which constitute the basic moral furniture of the human mind. Without the Jews, it might have been a much emptier place. I always say it's a good thing a non-Jew said that, because if a Jewish person said it, no one would believe it. And in the course of writing my first book, which is World Perfect, which is only on this topic of the incredible impact, transformative impact we Jews directly or indirectly have had in terms of religion and values, unbelievable. I came across dozens of presidents, prime ministers, philosophers, historians, thinkers. They all agree. The Jewish people, despite their teeny size, have been one of the most transformative forces in human history. Let me ask you guys, Adolf Hitler, looking at this quote, or John Adams, would he agree or disagree with their basic conclusion about the impact of the Jewish people? Does everyone see he would agree? He sees. The difference is not what they see, it's the reaction. Paul Johnson and John Adams say this is unbelievable. But Hitler, because his worldview is so antithetical, says this is the worst thing that happened. Ladies and gentlemen, Adolf Hitler is not evil because of his understanding of the Jewish people. He's remarkably clear in that respect, in seeing the power of the Jews. He's evil because of his reaction to the understanding. Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin wrote an amazing book, which happens to be the same, coincidentally came out the same year and the same title, with the same conclusion, but it was like the different, no, we didn't work together on it. But look at the end of their book, and I think this is the best book that goes through the real causes of anti-Semitism. Look how they summarize it at the end. From its earliest days, the raison d'être, the reason for being of Judaism has been to change the world for the better. This attempt to change the world, to challenge the gods, religious or secular, of societies around them, and to make moral demands upon others, has constantly been a source of tension between Jews and non-Jews. We now understand why so many non-Jews have regarded the mere existence of Jews, no matter how few, as terribly threatening. The mere existence of Jews with their different values and allegiances constitute a threat to the prevailing order. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been dragging the world, often reluctantly, kicking and screaming towards a certain vision of values based on relationship with God. And anti-Semitism is humanity's attempt to rebel against that final scenario in human history. Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, has a great quote. He says, a human being can survive anyhow as long as he has a proper why. Which means in simple English, people will go through tremendous pain and suffering and even give their lives if what they believe they are suffering or dying for is meaningful. And how much more so the Jewish people. All of us sitting in this room today are only here because our ancestors suffered terribly at the hands of so many different people, but did it gladly knowing that they were suffering and even giving their life for what's ultimate meaning, values, things that transcend life itself. On a collective level, by the way, no nation has ever been able to wipe us out, thank God. But on an individual level, what is potentially extremely dangerous for individual Jews is a combination of two things. One is anti-Semitism, being attacked for being Jewish, but being ignorant of why. Not appreciating what being Jewish is about, not having Jewish pride and Jewish identity and Jewish education. Take a Jew who thinks that Judaism is meaningless and irrelevant and expose that Jew to hatred. What decision will that person make? The worst decision, which is to assimilate. And that doesn't work for two reasons, which I want to end with. Why doesn't it work? Let me give you one final analogy, one final example. Imagine the situation. Many of you, I see, are parents already, so you don't need to imagine. You've done this already. But imagine you have a really cute daughter who has very red hair, and she goes off to preschool. And the first day she comes home crying because everyone made fun of her hair. They called her Carrot Top, or whatever. What are you going to do with your daughter? This is called Parent Effectiveness Training, PET. First you give your daughter a huge hug and a big kiss, and then what do you tell her? You're special, you're beautiful, you're different, you got a great future as a stop sign, anything positive. What's the one thing you're not going to tell your daughter? Dye your hair. The biggest mistake we can make as Jews is to think there's something wrong with us and we have to change. Because when we opt out of being Jewish and give up on our identity, that means that we break the chain. Everything our ancestors did for thousands of years was for nothing. But more than that, it doesn't work. Because one of the scariest and most interesting supernatural aspects of Jew hate is, unlike other hatreds, ladies and gentlemen, where when you are different, you're hated, and the more you become like the majority, the less you're hated, anti-Semitism is completely supernatural. The greatest explosions of anti-Semitism have always taken place in places where Jews are most different or most like non-Jews. What do you say? Most like. Whether it's Egypt before the Passover story, or Jews in Spain before 1492, or Jews in Germany before the Holocaust. The message we're getting is our role in history is far too critical. We cannot be allowed to disappear, because what we have to bring to the world is essential for the future survival and prosperity of the human race. So to put it all together and come to a close, before we even deal with the issue of why the Jews, the first question we have to deal with for ourselves, for our children, for our community is, why be Jewish? We have to be educated as Jews and proud and understand what we stand for. And when we have that, bring on the anti-Semites. We will outlast them all. And a few nights from now is going to be Passover. We're going to lift up our cup and say, V'hi sha'amda. In every generation they try and destroy us. And everyone who has tried to destroy us is gone, and we are still here. Am Yisrael Chai. We have to appreciate that point. But in terms of what is the real solution to anti-Semitism, we have to put all the excuses on the side. Yes, we need to commemorate the Holocaust. Yes, we need to tell the non-Jewish world that we don't do all of these horrible things that they accuse us of doing. And yes, we have to be proud Jews, but bottom line is, if we understand that ultimately this is an ideological struggle between our values versus the opposite values, and the best way to sum it up is this line by Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin, who was one of the great European Jewish leaders in the early 19th century. It's an amazing quote. He says, when Jews don't make Kiddush, Gentiles make Havdalah. Now let me explain this quote, because it's incredibly important what he says. Does everyone know what Kiddush and Havdalah are? Kiddush is what we say on Friday night with the wine, when we go from the normal days of the week to the higher spiritual level of Shabbat. At the end of Shabbat, we go down with a ceremony called Havdalah to a lower spiritual level. He doesn't mean literally making Kiddush and Havdalah. Kiddush is what we're about, guys. The job of being Jewish is not to serve God. It's not Torah and Mitzvot. Torah and Mitzvot are incredibly important, don't get me wrong. But they're the tools that allow us to do what our national historic mission is, to be Kiddush Hashem. Guys, we're the God squad, as we say in English. Our job is to act individually and collectively, using the system of Torah to create a model nation for the rest of the world, to elevate the world. And if we don't do that, and you can test this like gravity, if we don't do that, if we don't elevate the world goes in the opposite direction. When evil comes into the world, and you can test this throughout history, Jews will be the first target. And by the way, it always starts with us. You can tell how countries are doing in terms of democracy and human rights and freedom by how they treat their Jews. Hitler started with the Jews, but he went after a lot of other people. And by the way, George Gilder, who's a famous non-Jewish author, he wrote a book called The Israel Test. And he said that just as a Jew within the country is a measure of how the country is doing internally, in terms of its democracy and its rights and its freedoms, he said that Israel is the Jew amongst the nations. It's not an accident that the most dangerous rogue states, like North Korea and Iran, have their sights on the Jewish people. When evil comes into the world, it targets us first, and therefore the only solution to anti-Semitism is, of course, for Jews to be proactive. And by the way, you can't represent the Jewish people until you know what the Jewish people represents. As much as I've talked about the dangers of anti-Semitism, guys, ignorance is a greater threat to us than even the biggest anti-Semites. We have to be educated Jews. We have to be proud Jews. And it doesn't mean we have to be Jews to the exclusion of being part of the country we live in. You know, I was thinking, I'm in Greece today, I'm looking at the color of the flags. Everyone's got flags today. And I noticed very few flags look like the Greek flag and the Israeli flag. Almost all flags have red in them. Israel and Greece, the only two countries I think with blue. Blue is an interesting color. It's interesting. There must be a deeper connection. And allow me to add something in just for you guys that I was thinking when I was watching the parade today. If we go all the way back to the beginning of the Bible with the Noah's Ark story, and Noah had the 3 sons I mentioned, Shem, Ham, Yafet. So Ham is cursed by his father for doing inappropriate things to his father. Okay, Shem becomes the Jewish people. He gets a certain blessing. But I mentioned that Yafet, in Jewish tradition, Greece comes from Yafet, which by the way means, it's the root of the word Yofi, which is beauty. And it's amazing what God says in the Torah. He says, Yaft Elokim v'Yefet v'Yishkan b'Ohel Hashem. That Yefet, the beauty that is from that culture, should spread out to the world, but it needs to dwell in the tents of Shem, which means in Jewish values. There's a place for the synergy of the cultures together in this world, but without the values that we, the Jewish people, bring to this world, when they exist as separate cultures, they're going to be at odds with each other. And it's an important message for us, for you guys living outside the land of Israel, that you can bring the beauty of both cultures together, but first and foremost, we have to be proud as Jews. We have to be educated as Jews. We have to educate our children. We can't tell our children that Judaism is important and then not live it. Anyone who's a parent knows that our children do what we do, not what we tell them to do. And this is so important today. Look at the world today. The world needs values. It needs role models. And I'll tell you something else, guys. The world is not going to leave us alone until we get our act together. And if we don't willingly work to be proud Jews and unified, and we're sitting here fighting amongst each other. I have no idea what goes on in the Greek Jewish community, but everywhere I go, even a Jew on a desert island has to have 2 synagogues. That one I go into, that one I'm not going into. Ladies and gentlemen, we have to start looking at ourselves the way the anti-Semites look at us. Now let me explain that to close. It doesn't mean evil, we're terrible, but we notice that anti-Semites, when they look at us, they never look at us and say, you're religious, you're secular, you're conservative politically, you're liberal, you live in Israel. In their eyes, we are all Jews. There are millions of people who hate us, and we're fighting amongst each other. So I implore you, if this presentation had any impact on you tonight, we should take with it not to go back to sleep again. The anti-Semitism is not going to go back to sleep, but to make a commitment to grow as Jews. Judaism is like a ladder. It doesn't matter which step of the ladder on, but which way you're going. We can always be learning more and doing more, and for heaven's sake, working on Jewish unity. And I know it sounds like the impossible dream, but if you look at our history, everything about our history is impossible. David Ben-Gurion, you guys know Ben-Gurion? Yes. Who was not a religious man, but he knew his Jewish history. He said, a Jew who doesn't believe in miracles is not a realist. Guys, look at what we've accomplished. We've suffered the greatest hatred in the world, yet we've had a fantastically powerful, positive, transformative impact on the world. Now is the time to wake up, not to go back to sleep, but to be proactive, to make that Kiddush, to come together as a nation, representing the values that have changed the world, and to give the values that they really want. And when we do that, and only when we do that, do we not only get an end to anti-Semitism, but an end to bashing Israel. And not just for peace for the Jewish people, but peace for the whole world. And we should merit, guys, to see that soon and in our days. And thank you very much.
For this wonderful lecture, and thank you very much for speaking slowly. Πρώτα κάτι πολύ σημαντικό, μην ξεχάσετε να δώσετε τα ακουστικά πίσω στην Νίνα. Δεύτερον, όταν άκουσα το, και θα το πω στα αγγλικά, when I was listening to what you just said, we have to look at ourselves with the eyes of an anti-Semite. Something that I've heard many times like here in Greece is that, oh, you Jews, you help each other. well, let's help each other. Let's not make it a myth, let's make it reality. And αυτό που θα για να ολοκληρώσω δηλαδή σαν συμπέρασμα, νομίζω ότι αυτό που χρειάζεται είναι να μάθουμε για το τι είναι οι αξίες μας, τι σημαίνει να είμαστε Εβραίοι. Και όπως είπε, είναι μια γνωστή ιστορία, μία Εβραίος πήγε στον Σαμάι, ήταν δύο σοφοί, δύο πολύ μεγάλοι σοφοί, ο Ηλέλ και ο Σαμάι. Πήγε στον Σαμάι και είπε, θα μου διδάσκεις την Τωρά ενώ στέκομαι σε ένα πόδι. Ο Σαμάι θύμωσε και τον έδιωξε. Πήγε λοιπόν στον Ηλέλ και τι του είπε ο Ηλέλ, λέει πάλι, δίδαξε μου τον Ιουδαϊσμό ενώ στέκομαι σε ένα πόδι. Τι είπε? Είπε εντάξει, αγάπα τον πλησίον σου σαν τον εαυτό σου και μετά, τώρα δηλαδή, πήγαινε και να μελετήσεις. Πώς το λέμε στην κριτική? Λοιπόν, οπότε αυτό νομίζω μετά από τέτοια διάλεξη, αυτό πρέπει να κάνουμε. Να πάμε και να μελετήσουμε τι σημαίνει να είμαστε Εβραίοι και ποιες είναι οι αξίες μας. And maybe Ken, you have another wonderful lecture that we'll listen to in Israel, World Perfect, about what Jewish values have influenced the world. Maybe we'll get you to come back and speak to us about that. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ. Όποιος έχει ερώτηση, ας προσθέσει.